So let's jump in and get going here. I want to get into, we have a lot to talk about today. So today we're going to talk about wealth protection and how to really structure your business. You know, so many people in real estate always talk about gross closed commission and how do I get more buyers and sellers, but there's not enough people that are out there teaching financial intelligence to real estate agents and brokers. And one of the things that we've realized is we work with so many high-performing agents and teams, or teams that are, you know they're capable of doing more. They start working with us, they start generating more income. One of the things that we focus on is not just how much you make, but how much do you keep? And then how do we create tax strategy around the business that you're generating so that you're able to build wealth long-term, whether it's in real estate investing or in different plans that are out there. And I'll tell you one thing that I learned really early on is that I'm not an expert in any of those topics. And I have to surround myself with people who really are truly experts. And today we have one of the founders of Advanced Tax Group, JJ Childers, who's an attorney. He's a real estate investor. He works primarily in the real estate space his entire career, and he works with many of our clients and coaches in helping them with their wax strategy, or the tax strategy. You choose whatever your greatest need is of the day. JJ, I hope you're not helping us with our wax strategy.
Well, I'm kind of writing that down. That's a new term for me.
Right?
It saves us time. We don't have to say wealth protection and tax. We'll just say it's wax. I
So
like it.
Let's jump into this. Tell us a little bit about Advanced Tax Group, about where are you in the world, and like what do you focus on?
Well, I tell you, we've got a presence throughout the country. Some of us work remotely, and we catch up with each other at our various events that we do together and go out to visit clients. And I'm in Little Rock, Arkansas. I've been here for my entire career, and at least I tell people that's where I change out my bags. You know, sometimes it feels like I'm traveling so much to speak to different groups all over the country and making sure that we are covering people's assets as much as we possibly can. And we do that through Advanced Tax Group. We started it, Tony and I have worked together for a number of years, and we just kind of saw a need. You know, we did this with other organizations, and we said, you know what? We've got to take this thing bigger, because there are too many people that we've got to make sure we, as I look at it, almost spread the gospel to, you know, is making sure that we're sharing this information, because it's that important. Because, you know, you're correct when you say that, Verl, that, you know, what happens is people focus on trying to make as much money as they can, but at the end of the day, it's not what you gross, it's what you net. And a lot of that factors in with making sure that your assets are protected from a lawsuit standpoint, making sure you're protected against income taxes and other types of taxes, and also making sure that you have a plan for your family, because that's why people are working so hard, is to be able to build something that they can pass on, not even just to their children, but also to future generations, leave behind a legacy. So what we have done is built Advanced Tax Group, where we're able to help people to, number one, identify strategies that can help them, but then number two, actually get those implemented. You know, we're not consultants that we say, okay, I remember a commercial several years ago that the CEO is sitting at his desk and he's meeting with the consultants, and he says, sounds good, let's move forward. And the consultant looks, they say, we don't actually do this stuff. Well, that's what we do. We actually do this. We actually help people not only formulate the plan, but actually implement it. And it's not even just setting up the legal entities, but it's making sure that the entities are integrated into your overall business. So that's really what we do. I know that's a mouthful there, Burl, but at the same time, I just wanted to make sure I kind of provide some of that background and just letting people know that we help guide people throughout the process. We hold their hands, make sure that they get things taken care of, because if they don't get it implemented, it doesn't help them, and it really doesn't help us, because we want to make sure that we're building a great experience for our clients.
You know, one of the things I thought about as you were talking just now is with the class action lawsuit that's happened in real estate and all of the disruption in our marketplace. It's caused a lot of people to think about, are they protected in that scenario if somebody came after their assets, if they were wrapped into something, whether it's this lawsuit or something else? And the answer is most people aren't. So for everyone that's kind of here today, like that owns a house or that has any assets, what are some of the most powerful asset protection tools or systems that you recommend? Like, where do we start? Let's just start with that.
All right. Well, to me, the where we start is always with education, because what happens a lot of times is that people want to just take action so quickly that they end up taking the wrong action. So we always tell people, hey, spend a little bit of time. We're not saying that you have to become the absolute experts in this area. You've got us as your team surrounding you, but you really need to know a little bit about it. You wouldn't just go out and get involved in real estate without getting some knowledge, some expertise, some education and training. It's the same way when it comes to protecting your assets, because if you don't know how number one, some people may know what they need, but they don't know why they need it. And that's very important, because the reality is, how do they know what they need if they don't know why they need it? So we help them guide through that process, because the first thing is always going to be setting up a legal entity. The challenge you now have is, well, which one? Because sometimes it can be very confusing, because you're going to get a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and a lot of just wrong information. Sometimes people will say, I talked to somebody and they told me I need a corporation. And then somebody else will say, no, what you need is an S corporation. Then somebody else say you need an LLC. Well, these sound like they're completely different scenarios. The reality may be that you need all of these, depending upon you and your unique circumstances. So I always say begin with that, because everybody is going to be a little bit different. No one person is going to be exactly the same as somebody else. You've got different interests, you've got different assets, you've got different activities, you've got a different family makeup. There are just a lot of different things that have to be factored in when we make sure that we implement a plan to protect those assets. So that's the first step, is getting educated. And that's part of what we do, is we offer people an opportunity to visit with us to find that out. And that's something we do. Typically, people will pay us for a consultation. They pay us a consultation fee, and we sit down and we say, okay, tell us about yourself. And we're going to identify kind of your areas of weakness, but also your opportunities where you can maximize and increase your overall income and increase that bottom line, which is ultimately going to increase your overall wealth. So that's one of the first things that I would say, is take some time to learn what you need for your particular circumstances, because it's got to be customized. It's got to be personalized. It can't just be a one-size-fits-all plan. That doesn't exist. So that's really the first thing that I would tell people, Burl.
So a lot of agents will say, well, I've set up as an LLC. What does that mean?
Yeah, so great question. Typically, and here's the thing. I'm going to tell you, LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. Now, that may sound extraordinarily basic, but I speak to so many different groups and I'll say, all right, everybody, LLC, what does that stand for? And people will say, Limited Liability Corporation. I say, no, corporation. And I know I'm just being a lawyer here by being nitpicky, but corporation is a very distinct structure that is completely separate from a limited liability company. Now, one of the things, and this is very important, Verl, because people don't really understand this. There is no such thing as LLC taxation. Some people say, well, what do you mean there's no such thing as LLC taxation? I'm an LLC, I pay taxes. I say, well, sure you do, but you're going to pay taxes through a different type of method. If you are one person and you set up an LLC, that's what's called a single member LLC, and that is treated by the IRS as a disregarded entity. Translation, if it's a disregarded entity, they're just going to treat it like a sole proprietorship. And there were some major challenges with that when people first started doing it, because they would be challenged and they'd say, okay, well, if you're a disregarded entity, we're going to disregard it not only for tax purposes, but also disregard it for liability protection purposes. So you had people that were establishing their LLCs for the whole reason of getting limited liability, and then they wouldn't get the limited liability. So there have been lawsuits, in Florida in particular was one of the leaders in this. There was a case called the Olmstead case, and they essentially said a single member LLC does not get limited liability protection. So now they spent money to set something up, they have it in place, but they have no protection. And that's probably the worst position that you could be in, is thinking that you're protected and then finding out that you're not. Well, the way that they rectified that was that the Florida legislature went in and had to pass legislation to make sure that it did provide for the limited liability protection. So now other states have done the same thing. So even if you're just one person, you can still have this entity. But by default, if you're one person, it's going to be taxed as a disregarded entity, sole proprietorship. Well, if it's two or more people, then by default, it's taxed as a partnership. And there can be positives from that, but there can also be negatives from that, because if you're going to be taxed as a partnership and it's a distribution, that could be passed to you without having to pay the FICA tax, which we'll be talking about taxes quite a bit, but I just want to at least reference that right now. But it's also one of the things that you can choose, is that if you wanted to be taxed as a corporation, which a lot of people will say, if I'm in real estate, I definitely don't want to be taxed as a corporation. Well, First, you have to elect to be taxed as a corporation. I believe it's Form 8832, where you choose that classification. And then from there, you take the next step and say, okay, now I need to elect S corporation tax status. And the reason you would do that primarily is to avoid the FICA tax. Now, I don't want to get off into the weeds or anything, but when we start talking about the FICA tax, basically FICA is your Social Security and your Medicare taxes. And the way that it works is that those two components add up to 7.65%. So if you're an employer, you pay 7.65%. If you're an employee, you pay 7.65%. Well, a lot of times, if you're a realtor or a broker, you may be both. You may be self-employed. So essentially, you're paying as the employer and the employee. So now you have 7.65 times 2, which is 15.3%. Even on $50,000 of income, you're talking about $7,650 in FICA taxes that if you make that S Corp election, you can avoid and not have to pay those. And it's completely legal, but you have to know about it, and then you have to actually implement it. So even just on $50,000 of income, making that one election, that one tax move can save you $7,650 a year without even taking our first tax deduction. So tax deductions are just going to make that even better.
Yeah, it sounds simple, but why don't most people have structure like this? Is it because the confusion?
You know, bro, I think that's a lot of it. You know, sometimes, there's a saying that I have is a confused mind says no. If people don't understand what they're dealing with, a lot of times they shut down. And sometimes it's almost like they've got too many computer programs open and then their computer crashes. Same things happen to their brain. That mind computer shuts down because there's too much to try to factor in. And it can be bad to oversimplify it, but can also be bad to overcomplicate it. The key is finding kind of that balance and making sure that you have a healthy appreciation for the importance of this, but that you also have the desire, motivation, and dedication to make sure that you get it implemented. Because we can talk about it all day, but until you take action, nothing happens. I mean, we can say that about just about everything, but truly, when it comes to your legal entities, until you get them formed, executed, and implemented, and your properties and your assets and your businesses transferred in there, you've got no protection. You've got no potential tax benefits either. So we've got to make sure that we get that. And I think the biggest mistake is that people hear LLC, LP, GP, C Corp, S Corp, LL, LP, that you hear all of these different things. And you start saying, well, I don't want to make the wrong decision. So then they make the worst decision, which is no decision. So that's what we've really got to do. And that's why at Advanced Tax Group, we make sure that we help people understand what they're doing. Because again, it doesn't do anybody any good to just take action if you don't know why you're doing that and what you've just done. So we help educate that through that process. We don't just sell people things. We partner with people to make sure that they have the right protection in place.
JJ, Ron asked if you actually work yourselves in Texas or do you refer it out?
No, we actually do things in Texas. I work with clients on a regular basis in Texas. I just had somebody from Katy that I was working with this week, as a matter of fact. You're probably familiar with that. That's down in the Houston area. I think that's where you were from, right?
Yeah, he's on Lake Conroe.
Yeah, Lake Conroe. We're just 20 minutes from the Woodlands. That's our mark.
Very good. Yeah, we can definitely provide assistance down there. We work with a lot of clients from Texas.
Okay, so what do we need to know? So give us a like if I was starting to figure out how do I start the process? What does someone need to know before they start using a funding strategy, or what is a funding entity? How does that?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Before I'm gonna share my screen in just a moment. So I've got some slides. I don't want to get bogged down in too much into slides, but I wanted to make some points that I think are very important for people, and sometimes seeing those slides can help solidify that understanding. So I will be providing those. But the first thing that I always tell people is that the government and other sources are attempting to place what I call a lid on wealth. Now, that lid is an acronym for the 3 legal pitfalls of lawsuits, income taxes, and death taxes. Now, when we think about those lawsuits, income taxes, and death taxes, those are very important areas that we've got to pay attention to, because when it comes to lawsuits, studies have shown there's a new lawsuit filed on average every 30 seconds in this country. So in the short time we've been together, there have already been dozens of lawsuits filed. So you think about that, and it's becoming such a litigious environment out there, meaning a lot of people are suing a lot of other people, that it's not a matter of if you'll be sued, it's a matter of when. So we've got to make sure that we have that plan in place to safeguard our assets from the lawsuits before the lawsuit ever occurs. And then they say 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year. Well, that's factoring in across the board. If you're actively involved in real estate, your likelihood goes much higher than 1 out of every 4. So it's absolutely essential that you have protection in place. Now, the bad thing is we say 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year. Well, guess what? 4 out of every 4 people who generate income will be subjected to income taxes each and every year. So that becomes a little more near and dear to our hearts. So we've got to have a strategy in place that not only protects our assets, but also provides us with tax relief and tax mitigation assistance for implementing these strategies and getting involved in real estate. And then finally, when we talk about the death taxes, doesn't necessarily mean estate taxes, because the other thing, 4 out of every 4 people will die. Now, that's not the motivational part of my presentation, Burl, but I always got to make sure that I share that with people, because it happens. You know, again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So you've got to have a plan in place. Because here's what we've found is that in working with so many clients over the years, we see people that they have hopes, aspirations, and dreams, ambitions that they really want to. That's why they've invested in coaching programs, invested in training programs to learn how to do things and to do things better, more efficiently, more profitably. But if part of the reason they do that is so they have something to pass on to their families. Well, it's all going to be taken from you if you don't have a plan in place to protect against the threats to that wealth. So that's where an estate plan comes in. And the biggest thing, Burl, and I'm going to talk about these things individually, but the biggest thing that I want to make sure that people understand is that these all have to be thought about in collaboration with one another. It's not competitive in that you say, do I do asset protection, or do I do tax, or do I do estate planning? You do all the above, and that's going to be the key. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully I get this taken care of the right way.
While you do that, if you're set up as an LLC, can you switch to an S corp, or like when you have a consultation and you get into it with someone, you realize they have one entity that should be a different entity because of how they're structured? How difficult is it to switch?
You know, it's not really difficult. So yes, you can do that. And that's something that we work with people on a regular basis, is making sure that we identify where they are, because sometimes people are afraid to take action because they don't want to make that, that misstep or the wrong move. And we say, hey, put something in place. And if you put something in place before you met with us and knew how to do it the right way, we'll help you to do it the right way. So we do a lot of that, Burl. And going back, because sometimes people say, oh I guess I messed it all up because I had it set up as an LLC and then I was, by default, either a disregarded entity or a partnership. Hey, we can always make that change for you. So that's something that we talk to people about. And it's going to be a matter of, we always look at your assets and your activities to make sure that we have the right parts in place to give you the maximum protection from the lawsuits, from the income taxes, from the death taxes.
Thank you for answering that.
Yeah. Now let me show you, you asked me about the funding strategy. And, first of all, I want to talk about something I refer to as enlightened asset protection. And one of the things that we're going to see is when we're talking about wealth protection wizardry, I want to have enlightened strategies that are different. This is not just your normal way of doing things. And I think probably my favorite definition of enlightened is from the Cambridge Dictionary, where it says, showing understanding, acting in a positive way, and not following old-fashioned or false beliefs. And I don't think all things are old-fashioned or bad by any means. Sometimes I think we need to get back to some old-fashioned things. But when it comes to old-fashioned strategies, sometimes they don't provide you the best results when you are facing new threats. So we've got to make sure there are certain things that are going to be kind of fundamental to everything that we do. But I want to make sure that we kind of go above and beyond. One of the things, bro, that you asked me to do was to talk about things that are a little more edgy, a little more, because you work with some of the best in the business, and we want to make sure that they have access to some of the best strategies. So I begin with this funding entity. So I call this fundamentals of funding, where we just kind of want to introduce this concept. What I see a lot of times with real estate investors in particular is that they'll come in and they'll purchase a property. Now, obviously, we all know that there are ways that you can put a property together with no money down, but typically you're going to have to come in and put in some money, maybe have some skin in the game. So what I work with clients on a regular basis on is they'll come in and they'll say, okay, I'm going to get the primary funding for this entity. So maybe I take out an 80% loan to value for the mortgage, the initial mortgage, and then they come in with 20% down. Well, if we look at what it is that we're actually protecting ourselves from, initially, if we have that mortgage against 80% of our property, then even if somebody sues us, the bank, the lender, is going to be first in line as far as being paid, because technically we don't own that house until that lien for the mortgage is released, till that is satisfied. Well, what that does is that it leaves 20% open so that if somebody did come in and sue us, they could take that 20%, they could take our equity. And to protect against that, what I tell people is, I said, think about this. If you borrowed money from somebody else for your secondary funding, so if you borrowed for secondary funding, that person's also going to file a lien for that 20%. So they said, yeah, but I don't need that additional funding. I already have my own money. I said, well, that's great, but how about we add an additional step here? What if, rather than you just putting that money in yourself to that property, what if you put that money into an LLC that we will call a funding company, that funding LLC? So when you put that money into the funding entity, that's your initial capital contribution. So in that particular entity, you have a risk of losing that. However, we've got to understand that that funding entity is only going to have interaction with one client. That one client is going to be our other legal entity. So we are loaning money to the other entity, and then to substantiate that loan, to document that, we've got to make sure that we have the promissory note. We've got to have, the lien that we're going to file against the property for that additional 20%. Sometimes we may take a larger one so that it may even be more than just the 20%. We're going to say, okay, we want a larger lien. Doesn't mean that we're going to get paid more, but what it means is that now the property is more fully encumbered. So anybody from the outside looking to sue us now sees that that property may even look to be underwater. Well, they think, I'm not going to sue this entity because it owes more than it's worth.
There's no equity.
Yeah, so from that standpoint, they're saying, hey, that helps to avoid lawsuits. So we've got to have that in place. But one of the things that, that I put here as far as the steps, we've got to set up the entity, fund that entity, and now that entity is going to do business with our other entity. Well, that's going to require substantiation and documentation. So we're going to have the agreement, which is going to be secured by a promissory note with the other legal entity, so that then we file the lien to make sure that it's fully encumbered. Now, here's where I like to take things a little further, Verl, and we do what's called cross-collateralization. So what banks can do, and I've even had this done to me as a borrower, where I was at a certain point with my lender that they said, you know what, we'll keep loaning you money. However, we want to cross-collateralize your properties, meaning even though I borrowed the money on one of the properties, they still placed a lien on all of my properties, basically kind of a blanket that kind of covered everything, so that then it looked great from an asset protection standpoint. I wasn't making additional payments for anything through the cross-collateralization. So you've got to take a look at, why would we want to have something like that? Because most people think, well, if my property is fully encumbered, how am I ever going to borrow any money ever again? Well, if you work with lenders that understand this, and typically if you're working with, say, maybe a private client group, maybe you've got a private banker in some of these organizations, they are more sophisticated and they'll understand it. When you go to a frontline, first year, early career lender, that's not necessarily, they're not going to understand a lot of these strategies the way that a more seasoned lender will understand these. And then you can explain it. And then you're able to explain to them, hey, this is my entity. I'm just doing this for liability protection purposes. You're still in first position. So they're not concerned that you're trying to do anything that, because sometimes people want so much privacy. We don't necessarily have to have all that privacy from the lenders because the lenders aren't the ones who are worried about suing us. Speaking of suing, when we look at this, nobody is going to sue the funding company because they didn't have any interaction with the funding company. And if you have no interaction, there's no potential cause of action. There's nothing that you've got to state a cause of action. If you fail to state a claim upon which relief can be granted, that case is going to be dismissed. So we've got some tremendous asset protection there as well. So that's what I wanted to share that, because I just, in talking with real estate investors over the years, that's one, even when I talk to people about things that are just, you know, really revolutionary, when I share this one, they say, wow, I've never even heard of anything like that. So I wanted to make sure that I covered that here today for those people watching this webinar.
I think that's fascinating. That just happened in the Supreme Court today. They dismissed the case because the plaintiff had no standing. They didn't have the right to be there. Basically, they were just bringing suit.
I saw that.
Kind of a crazy world we're living in. All right, so as you get into asset protection, you're talking about, like, if you don't own a bunch of properties, you're not investing in a whole bunch of real estate, do you still need to go through the process of setting up strategies for tax protection? And
Yes, you do. Yeah, and so first, let's, from the standpoint of when we talk about asset protection, a lot of times people say, well, I don't have a lot of assets. Well, the challenge is you never will if you don't have protection in place. Because even what I tell people is that we're protecting your assets, but we also have to protect your activities. So a lot of people, the activities with which they're involved, basically it's you're interacting with somebody else. Well, people out there, you know, you may have heard me say this before, Viral, but, you know, one time I was working with a prospective client and they said, hey, you know what? I said, how can I help you? And they told me, they said, I just want you to help keep my assets out of the sewers. And I just kind of looked at them. I said, well, you know, out of the sewers, I don't understand what you're saying. So they basically took me through the process. They say, what do you call someone who teaches? I said, well, a teacher. And then they said, what do you call someone who speaks? I said, a speaker. They said, what do you call someone who sues? I said, a sewer. I said, okay. I said, now I get it. All right. So now I said, now I understand what you're looking to protect yourself from. I said that, I guess that makes me not so much an attorney as I'm involved in sewer management, you know, whatever it takes. But when we're looking at this, we're trying to protect ourselves against those people that filed the lawsuit. So a lot of times, you know, people will badmouth lawyers, but a lawyer can't make any money if he doesn't have a client. So it becomes, you've got to have that client that then says, hey, I'm going to sue somebody. Now, do attorneys oftentimes encourage that? Absolutely. So we want to make sure that we have a plan in place to protect against that. Because sometimes people may say, hey, you know, as a realtor, you didn't get the best deal for me that you could have. And that was, you know, negligence on your part. I mean, no matter what it is, there's always craziness that people can file a lawsuit. And even if it has very little or no merit, it's just the hassle of having to deal with it. Knowing that you have this protection in place makes you feel that much more confident that you're not going to have to constantly worry about potential liability. So the next thing that I always talk to people about is what I refer to as enlightened estate planning. Because as I mentioned earlier, Viral, you know, 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year, but guess what? 4 out of every 4 people will die. And as a result, you've got to have a plan for how your assets, how your wealth, how that's going to be passed to your heirs and beneficiaries when that time comes.
So JJ, I want to let me pipe in here for just a minute if I can. So, you know, my wife's up in Canada with her family, and her father's family, they're all aging, and they were 11 brothers and sisters, and they didn't have any they didn't really have any wealth planning or distribution set up, and so it's causing unbelievable fighting amongst the siblings, and it's creating wedges in the family that I don't know are going to be repairable, because the parents didn't think through what they're going to do with their assets upon their death. And it's sad to see. So I think that this is one of the most important things that we do, especially as real estate agents. When you know, we don't seem to think about this when we're in our 20s, but when we're in our 50s, it starts to becoming more important that we think through, okay, so how do I want my estate to be divided, and what are the things that matter? And, you know, we got people fighting over Coca-Cola signs and, you know, coin rings.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of interesting is, you know, one of the things I went to Pepperdine University School of Law and got my master's law degree in dispute resolution. And what I had to write my final paper on was anything that I wanted to talk about. And I said, you know what, I want to talk about the importance of implementing dispute resolution strategies into estate planning. And basically, it's kind of a process called holistic estate planning, to where people will even have maybe a family retreat where they all get together and talk things through, but you've got to have, essentially an agenda. It becomes, facilitating a meeting of how we're going to do all of these things. And sometimes it's with financial advisors and attorneys and the accountants, and sometimes it's just kind of more informal, but either way, you need to go through that process. And that's part of making sure, where I said earlier, enlightened means, not getting stuck in these old-fashioned ways. Old-fashioned way was, okay, I'm just going to have a will and I'll just leave it to my family and they can just kind of, duke it out and see who's going to get what. Well, that doesn't necessarily work as well. And like you said, I've seen families just divided to where they may have been really close, and then because money has a way of doing certain things to people, and it's not always good. So you've got to have something in place. If you just have a will, that's better than having nothing at all. If you have nothing at all, that's called dying intestate. Intestate means without a plan. So if you don't have a plan, the government has a plan for you. Now, they have laid out sequentially how your assets will be distributed to your family members. And there is no, we're going to give you this portion of this, we're going to give you this, but it's no, you guys split this. Well, sometimes the only way to split something is to sell it, liquidate it. And, there's a reason people go to estate sales. They go to estate sales to buy things cheap, pennies on the dollar. Well, the worst thing is when we're selling our estate for pennies on the dollar. So the better job we do of making sure that that's clearly laid out, the more effective it's going to be and the more beneficial it will be to our heirs who we're leaving everything to. Now, to avoid that intestate succession, people will have a will. The challenge with a will is that a will has to go through the probate process. So when we talk about the probate process, basically what that means is that is the court supervision of the distribution of your assets. So now a court is getting involved to make sure that your will is followed. However, that's the time where people can bring up disputes. But before they even bring up disputes, we've got attorney fees, accounting fees, appraisal fees, administrative fees. So this can end up costing a pretty significant portion of your overall wealth. And the more complicated you are, the more complicated probate will be. And the more complicated it is, the more expensive it'll be. And it's based on the gross value of your assets, your gross estate rather than the net value. And that can end up being a significant amount of money, and you may not even have that money. So now we've got to liquidate assets just to pay for the probate fees. So we've got to avoid that. The way we do that is with a revocable living trust. Now, the way that the revocable living trust works is that during your lifetime, while you are living, hence the name living trust, that's what goes through the probate process. It bypasses it because the transfer has already occurred. So all those assets that would have gone through the probate process, now they've been transferred into the trust during our lifetime. So whenever we die, somebody just takes over the trust. There's no transfer that occurs, so there's nothing for the probate court to oversee. So having that set up can save people time, effort, energy, and a lot of money and aggravation. But we've got to make sure we put it in place. Sometimes people fail to do this because they hear trust and they start thinking about, well, I guess I have to be a multi-millionaire, if not billionaire, before I think about a trust. No, trusts are commonplace nowadays for just about everyone, especially small business owners, people that own real estate, people that have their own business. You've got to make sure that you have a plan in place to avoid that probate process and to expeditiously and efficiently pass on your wealth to your heirs and beneficiaries. And we can do things in a way that we can provide for multiple generations. Sometimes people are afraid that, what if I leave something to my kids or my grandkids and then they just blow it all? Well, they absolutely could if you don't have the right plan in place. One of the things that we work with clients on a regular basis is making sure that they understand, hey, you can put restrictions on this. I was talking to a client earlier this week, and they said, okay, well, we're concerned about potential divorces from our kids, spouses. I said, okay, well, we have a provision in the trust that protects against that, so you can get that added protection and the added benefits there. So that's just, there's so much that you can do, which is part of why we say wealth protection wizardry, is that, there are all sorts of things that you can do, but you have to basically think through what you want to accomplish. We can do it for you, but we have to know what it is that you want to do, and then we can draft things to accomplish your objectives.
So most of the things you're talking about are understanding what's available and then creating the instrument that creates the protection. And then that sits in your safety deposit box, or what do you do with it? Is it something that has to be filed taxes on every year? Do you have to do things to keep your documentation current? What's the maintenance of an entity when you start, doing these kinds of instruments?
Yeah, as far as I'm saying, that's a great question, because what happens is people sometimes mistakenly believe that, hey, if I have a trust, now I guess I have to have a trust officer. I've got to work with the trust department of some bank. Well, not at all. When you set up your trust, it's what's referred to as a grantor trust, meaning you are the grantor and you will retain full control over it during your lifetime. So while you're alive, you still continue to do things the way you've always done them. Now, the legal entities that we've been talking about before are owned by that trust. So the legal entity continues to operate the way it always has. The trust doesn't even come into play, other than it is now the owner of the units of ownership of that LLC, or the shares of stock in the corporation or S corporation. So it's almost no different than if I own Microsoft stock, that if I sold it to you, Microsoft is not going to change the way that they're doing things. They're going to keep doing things the same way. Just because the title is transferred into the trust, it doesn't impact it. Same thing with as far as selling your house, buying a house. I've had times where I've had to transfer it out of a trust and then transfer it back in after a refinancing or after a closing. And that's generally just due to the title company not necessarily having that experience. But I've also had times where they say, no problem at all, we'll go ahead and close on it and we'll get everything taken care of during that initial closing. But sometimes if we have to go back after the fact, that's not a problem issue. You have to do a transfer deed, and we're able to do that. That's part of what we work with clients on a regular basis. So it's really not that challenging. Now, whenever you pass away, you will have designated a successor trustee. So yes, you'll keep this kind of in a safe place, and you want to make sure that the people that are going to be your decision makers whenever you pass away, that they know, number one, it's a good idea to visit with them and try to lay out, what your expectations are. Number two, tell them where the documentation is and make sure that it's all been executed, signed and notarized, and then make sure that they have access to it. So they're going to need this at some point, so that when they go in to take over on the account, they're going to need that documentation to basically demonstrate that they are the successor trustee and they have authorization to take over this for you. So really, overall, I say it's not difficult, but it is different. And sometimes when things are different, it can make them seem a little difficult.
So when tax happens, is each entity taxed separately, or is it a pass-through tax where one tax applies to?
Yeah, for the trust, trust is what's referred to as tax neutral. So basically, it doesn't come into play from an individual income tax standpoint. Now, so during your lifetime, it's still going to basically be taxed the way that it was, as far as if you had various LLCs, those LLCs, depending upon, as long as they're not C corporations, they're going to be pass-through entities. And as pass-through entities, the LLC doesn't pay taxes, but that doesn't mean taxes aren't paid. The income and the tax liability passes through to the owners of those LLCs. If it's a C corporation, it pays its own tax at corporate tax brackets.
All right, so Ron had a question about some properties he owns. Let me ask it. He says with 4 free and clear properties, he says, I recommended financing 75% at 3% to lock in my equity. What enlightened strategy may have helped? Not sure that there's enough in the question, Ron.
Question was, we were trying to, this client's bought 11 and sold 8 and 11 properties through me, and he still owns 4 that I'm managing. And when the rates really went in the tank and they were like 2.5, 3, I told him, I said, look, just refinance to 75% and protect your equity. And they've got smart advisors, but nobody would tell them to do anything like that. I mean, maybe I was too far out of the box. I don't know.
I don't think so. I think, I mean, number one, that's a great strategy. See, I tell people all the time, debt is an absolutely incredible asset protection tool. Now, debt, the great thing about the way I look at real estate, one of my favorite, real estate is one of my favorite, if not my favorite overall investment. And part of the reason I love it is because we can utilize leverage. Well, the great thing about leverage is we can control a whole lot more property with a lot less money, and that can be good, but it can also be bad. When we know what we're doing as far as tapping into that, you know, Ron, even if they hadn't even accessed, like let's say rather than taking out a line of credit, they just established a line of credit, even if they haven't accessed it, there's still a lien on the property. So anybody that's looking to sue them sees that lien. And if you immediately accessed that line of credit, now you could say, okay, I'm going to access it. Now they're going to have the perfected security interest on it. So now anybody that sues them is going to be second in line. So I don't think you were thinking out of the box, but you've brought up a point that happens quite regularly, and that is you come up with a creative idea and other people are not familiar with it. So then they kind of,
Right.
dismiss it. I like to say, if they're not up on it, they're down on it. Because typically I'll tell people, number one, if your attorney or your accountant hasn't shared this idea with you, there's two reasons. Number one, they didn't know about it. Well, that's not good. Number two, they did know about it. They just chose not to share it with you. Well, that's not good either. Because, Verl, you asked me as far as what's the first thing we do, we've got to be educated about some of these things. So
Right.
we've got to make sure that we continue to get as much knowledge as possible, not to the point where it's paralysis of analysis, but it's making sure that we have a decent base level understanding, that we've got people around us, as you mentioned from the very beginning, saying, hey, I recognize I'm not an expert in this particular area, so I surround myself with people that are. That's going to be the most important step you could possibly take right there.
Okay. The only issue I had, not issue, but the question I had is, if you get a line of credit and it's against the property, that's not a permanent line of credit, is it? I mean, for 30 years, like refinancing would be.
Right. As far as, so you've got access to that. But like I said, even if you didn't tap into it, even if you just got it approved and now there's a lien on it. So from a aesthetics perspective, nobody's going to want to go after it. But then if you
Okay.
did borrow it, let's say you borrowed it and then you used it to buy other properties, through that fund, you borrowed it, put it into a funding entity. Now that funding entity went and bought new properties. Now it's got a lien against the new properties that you bought.
I was kind of thinking I might be able to use some of that 75% to buy additional properties for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. See,
Yeah, I
you're
mean,
thinking right.
they're just super conservative. But I think rates are going to come back down at some point in the future, somewhere between 4 and 5. And I think we'll get the same kind of, maybe not as graphic as it was in years past, but I think we'll still get the same boost.
Well, I hope you're right, Ron.
Well, it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Exactly.
Nope.
But I think we got to pay our debt somehow. So maybe we'll get a bump from the Fed, but not this year, I don't think.
Well, you just gave me a great transition because you said we got to pay our debt somehow. And when it comes to paying off the debt, when it comes to doing anything, basically the only way that the government produces revenue is through taxes. The government doesn't sell anything. They don't, really build a whole lot of anything. Basically, they get all their money from us. So if they need new money, let's say that the way we all are structured is that, hey, if I want to make more money, I'll go and get involved in new activities that are income producing activities, or getting more involved in other investments. Well, the government just says, why would we do that? We can just tax people more. And the thing is, the government has, basically a system that is rigged. Now, that may come, some of you may be saying, wait, you mean it's rigged? What do you mean? Others of you may say, well, thanks for sharing the obvious with us. The system is rigged, completely rigged, absolutely, undeniably. We've got two tax systems, one for individuals and one for businesses. Now, when I say it's rigged and that there is discrimination against one over the other, do you suppose it's rigged in favor of the individuals, or is it rigged in favor of the businesses? Well, as you can imagine, the businesses far and away, because the way that it works is basically as individuals, we make money, we pay taxes on that money, we get to spend what's left over. Well, if there's not enough left over to take care of all of our wants and needs, who suffers? Well, sadly, we suffer. Well, it's a different scenario when we're talking about businesses. You see, businesses under Section 162 of the tax code, all business expenses are deductible. So the way the system works with businesses is we make money, we spend it on whatever's ordinary and necessary, and then we pay taxes on what's left over. Well, what if there's not enough left over? Well, we've already taken care of all of our wants and needs, so we're not as concerned about that. If there's not enough left over to pay a big amount of taxes, now who suffers? Us or the government? Well, now it's the government, which you look at this and you say, hey, people will tell you trickle-down economics doesn't work, and I'm not going to get all political, but I look at it and I say, hey, if you're spending more money into the economy, yeah, I got a tax deduction for it, but I still had to put that money out into the economy. That helps to grease the wheels and make sure that everything continues rocking and rolling, moving and shaking, making things happen. So that's just a way that it does it, which is part of why they allow us to do this. And the thing is, people will say, oh yeah, but what if the Democrats are in charge? They say, oh, well, what if the Republicans are in charge? I don't care. You know who's in charge? Money. Money is given to politicians, and they want to make sure that they take care of the people that give them the money. Now, again, I'm not being partisan by any means, whether it's a Republican that's in the White House, Democrats in the White House, Republican control of Congress, or Democratic control. The key is, as long as they don't go too far where it's just horribly oppressive, and some people may say, yeah, well, yeah, they will. You got to remember, in order to be in Congress, you've got to be elected. More importantly, you've got to be reelected. Well, that takes money. So who do you suppose is giving more money, individuals or businesses? They're going to take care of businesses. So the key is, if we know that there's this discrimination, I hate discrimination, because sadly, you can't just say, okay, well, discrimination exists. I'm going to make sure I change myself to a group that's not discriminated against. Well, you can't do that in almost any other area, but you can do it when it comes to business versus individual. All we have to do is change how we are structured, rather than just receiving all of our income in our names individually, receive it in the name of a business. So now if you're able to do that, it opens up an entire world to you of deductions that you never even knew existed. And I tell you, the longer I do this, the more convinced I am that most people have no idea what it means to deduct something. And part of the reason for that is that they're not used to deducting anything. To them, they say, hey, taxes were taken on my paycheck before I ever received that paycheck. Because that's how I firmly believe if everybody had to write a check for their taxes rather than just having it taken out automatically, people would be way more upset about taxes. But because the brilliance of their system is to say, no, let's just pull it out before they ever see it. So now they don't have the chance to get as upset about it. Well, maybe I'm getting people upset, but I say, no, let me make you happy by helping you become more enlightened about all of the different tax deductions that you have at your disposal, as long as you know about them and as long as you position yourself to take advantage of those. Things with real estate, you talk about like cost segregation. Something about cost segregation that is that, some real estate professionals say, oh yeah, I get that. I understand that. There are others that say, I've never even heard of it. You've got, tax deferred exchanges. You've got all sorts of different things you can do with your properties as long as you have it structured the right way. And that's what's so important. But for many people, they don't do this because they didn't know that it even existed. Well, once they become aware, now it's time to take action. So what are the actions? What's the steps that you need to take? That's kind of where we kind of provide that type of assistance to people. But, Verl made a great point. He said, how does this all kind of tie together? Well, that's what's referred to as enlightened entity structuring. Because, when people say, where do I start? Well, it's not starting with your estate plan. It's not starting with your business planning. It's not starting with reducing your taxes. It's really starting by taking a look at where you are, what you need, and then identifying an overall plan. It's a plan, it's a process, it's a system, and that system needs to be customized to you and your unique circumstances, and then it's got to be implemented. And see, I've seen so many groups out there that they'll say, okay, well, we'll help people identify what they need to do. And then they stop there. And then you have other people say, okay, well, we'll even design a plan for you and we'll just, sell that to you. And they say, okay, and we quit there. And then people are left saying, okay, I paid for this, or I implemented this. I tried to do what was right, but I don't know what to do now. Well, that's where we've kind of added that final portion to the overall process and make sure that we say, hey, we're going to help you to conceive it, to make sure that it's implemented so you can achieve your overall objectives and accomplish those objectives, but you've got to make sure you know what you're doing. So that's part of what makes Advanced Tax Group, so unique in this particular area, is that we do it all. And that's part of why Vril chose to work with us through Workman Success Systems and say, hey, I want to provide, as everyone has come to expect, Vril provides amazing service. He provides an overall system that says, hey, don't go out there and try to reinvent the wheel. How about you find something that actually works and then just work it in your business to get the types of results that you're able to get. That's what we do when it comes to the asset protection, estate planning, and tax reduction, is providing you with that plan and the assistance to actually implement that.
So when you, can you see why we like these guys, Ricky and Ron, and why they're, there's so many people that talk the talk, but really don't have the depth of knowledge and the understanding and the how to actually help our clients put their structures together, make it all work. Morgan, I wish when I was in my 20s, somebody would help me set up things correctly. And so that I had a lifelong of doing it instead of waiting till I was in my late 40s before we start creating structure that made sense from a business perspective. When I think about tax right now, on the way to the office this morning, I was listening to the radio, and there was a guy on from Denver that was talking about, they were talking about the school systems being overwhelmed with the children of the immigrants that have been coming in by the millions across the country, and who's going to pay for their education. Most of them don't speak English. Most of them have not been ever to school. And they were just talking about the ramifications on the states from a financial perspective of just educating the children and what's going on in the emergency rooms. And it all comes down to who pays for all that, and who pays for that is we do. And it's paid for us in taxes. And I don't mind paying my fair share, but I think that as business owners, we have a responsibility to be profitable and to protect our assets so that we can keep other people employed, so that we can serve our clients and do the right things. And so that's, to me, why I always want to live on the edge of the tax law. I want to do everything I legally possibly can do to pay as little taxes as possible. But I always want to be legal, and I always want to be ethical. And you have to have people in your court and on your team that can help you get there. And you can also be more conservative. That's your nature. But for me, I want to walk on that edge of, I want to make sure I'm legal and ethical, and I want to make sure I take every advantage that's available to me. What are some of the things that, if there is a couple, that people don't think about? Do you have a favorite thing, a favorite strategy that people either don't use or don't know about?
Probably one of my favorite strategies is what's referred to as the Augusta rule. And I don't know if it's one that you or any of our viewers or participants.
You told me about this. I was like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, and I'll kind of try to condense it down. The reason it's called the Augusta rule is that it started basically in Augusta, Georgia, at the Augusta National Club that was behind this. And basically, for those people that know or don't know, Augusta National Club is where the Masters golf tournament is held. And the Masters is probably, the preeminent event, at least in my eyes. It's the most prestigious golf tournament in the entire world. And they only attract, the greatest players in the world play, and then the past champions, as they say, a tradition unlike any other. Well, so many people, to get tickets to the Masters, it's a major accomplishment. But what happens is it's all in Augusta, Georgia. Well, Augusta, Georgia is not this booming metropolis. It's a very small town. For 2 weeks throughout the year, the golfing world transcends and converges upon tiny Augusta, Georgia. They need a place to sleep. They need a place to stay. Well, it wouldn't make sense to build a bunch of hotels that are going to sit empty for 50 weeks or, mostly empty for 50 weeks just because there's not enough demand. So people would stay in people's homes. So you could rent out your home, and basically you could rent out the home for enough money that it would pay your mortgage for the entire year. People were making so much money on this because they could just basically name their price based on supply and demand. Well, what happened was that people were started getting taxed on this, and they said, wait a second, I don't want to do this anymore if I'm going to have to pay taxes on it, or I'm going to have to raise my prices so high to account for the taxes that it kind of stymied the market. Well, if you know anything about Augusta National Club, you know that it's very exclusive membership. So the members said, hey, we've got to fix this. So they lobbied Congress and they got a law passed. It's become known as it's Section 280 capital A of the tax code, but it's referred to informally as the Augusta rule. Basically, it says you can rent out your personal residence for 14 days or less, and the income you receive for that 14 days is non-taxable to you. So let's think about it. If you rent out your home for $1,000 a day for 14 days, that's $14,000 that you can now receive completely tax-free. Well, sometimes people say, well, that's great, but I don't live in Augusta. Well, it doesn't matter. It's not just for Augusta. This is anywhere in the country. So you can rent out your home, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, who am I going to rent my home to? Well, could you rent it to a business? That's what the people in Augusta are doing. They're renting their homes to the businesses that come in there. Sure, you can rent it to a business. Well, where are you going to find a business that wants to rent your home? Well, how about your business? As long as you have a business entity, an LLC, a corporation, whatever it may be, but it's got to be a multi-member or taxed as an S corporation, C corporation, because a single member LLC does not enable you to take advantage of this. But basically now your business, let's say you've got income in your business, you lease out the house for 14 days for meetings throughout the year. 14 days, $1,000 a day, that's $14,000 that you deducted from your business that you now took personally that you didn't have to pay taxes on. So think about that, an extra 14 grand to now be able to have that money tax-free. And I know some of you may be thinking 14 grand, big deal, but I'm saying, no, that's a starting point. It's 14 grand. And then number two, now you have access to that Section 162 of the tax code that I mentioned. All ordinary and necessary business expenses are deductible, which is probably my favorite tax code section in the entire tax code, just because of how broad it is and how we can just make this, so expansive. That's what I love about it. And, that's really what we do, Verl, is, work with people on identifying these things and making sure that, sometimes the biggest mistake people can make is thinking that they've got everything taken care of, but not knowing for sure.
JJ, jump to how do we contact you slide.
Well, let's do it.
By the way,
Basically, advanced tax code. Let me tell you what I'm going to offer today, just for your particular students and clients and team members. We're going to we have an offer where we're going to provide a free wealth protection strategy. You get one of these calls with our wealth experts. And this is where we're going to talk all about you and your particular needs so that we can design a plan for you. And I told you we usually charge for this. This is valued at $1,000. I'd say it should be valued a lot higher than $1,000, because basically you're going to identify things even in this consultation that will save you far more than that $1,000. But the good news is, because they're part of Workman Success Systems, they're not going to pay $1,000. We actually offer that completely free of charge. So in addition, to give people an incentive, we're going to have two free courses, one called Enlightened Estate Planning and another called Enlightened Asset Protection. And then we're going to give you two consultations, one with a wealth protection expert and one with our tax professional team. So you've got to make sure that you have both of these areas integrating with one another. We work very closely together, but we wanted to give you two different strategies, because what we've found is that sometimes people get so focused on asset protection, they forget about taxes. And sometimes they're so focused on taxes, they forget about asset protection. We wanted to compartmentalize these and say, you know what? You really need two. You need two different strategy sessions to identify how this can benefit you. And the way I look at it, Earl, is, if there was a way to give yourself better protection, if there was a way to pay less in taxes, wouldn't you at least want to hear about it? That's part of what we do on a regular basis. And yeah, we charge for it. but we're not charging anyone associated with Workman Success Systems because we recognize that that's a different level of person. It's a different level of just accomplishment and professionalism. And we said, you know what? We want to reward you for that. And as a result, we're going to make this available to you absolutely free. Now, to take advantage of it, all you have to do, I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And I'm going to basically, in the chat section, I'm going to have Tony put in there. Right now, he just put in there, it says start.advancedtaxgroup.com workman-success call-A. So if you click on that in the chat right now, that will take you to our calendar where you can book a consultation. And again, as I mentioned, you know, if there's a way to make your business more profitable, if there's a way to protect your assets, if there's a way to pass on more wealth to your family, wouldn't you at least want to hear about it? That's what we're giving you the opportunity to do. So take advantage of that. Click on there. Give us an opportunity to visit with you, meet with you, and most importantly, help you identify ways to cover your assets.
All right. So I don't know if everybody picked that up. They got a $14,000 free income, non-taxable income tip on this call today. I thought that was great and a lot of other great strategies. So JJ, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate your partnership and for the investment you make in Workman and helping our clients be better. And thanks for taking the time to be here today, Tony. Appreciate all the energy and the knowledge and inspiration that you bring to our family. This is a great company. They do a great job. And you know, I'm not. You don't see us put a lot of vendors on webinars, and there's a reason we don't. And these guys do the right thing, and so they're here because they do a good job for our clients. They're a trusted entity, and we're aligned in our values, and those are all really important to us. And we'll play this again for people who missed this. So we'll make sure this becomes live in our training center so people can have more access to the information that we shared here. On behalf of Workman Success and Advanced Tax Group, thanks for being here, everybody. We appreciate it. And if you have more questions, sign up for a consultation and make your list, and they'll do their best to help you all. Bye, everybody. Thank you very much.